Perfect. Hey, awesome. All right. Excited to have everyone here. Lochie will be leading most of the session. We'll engage in the conversation, and hopefully you can participate as well. Francesca, which you also see on camera, is one of our colleagues, and she's doing all the behind the scenes to make sure that these webinars happen. So yeah, really excited to kind of have a bit of your feedback as well, jump in conversations, drop in the chat, which industry you're working on, and we're going to prompt you with, of course, a couple of the questions. And if you can participate, which helps for like an engaging conversation, and make sure we're speaking about the problems that you are having today when it comes to supply chain transparency, when it comes to answering requests or requesting data from your suppliers, and so forth. We have a couple of cameras on, so when we send you the recording, it'll be very nicely edited, and maybe you can share it with your colleagues or your own suppliers to understand a bit more about what's happening in the space.
Fantastic. Awesome. Yeah, so welcome everyone, and great to have you all here. I'm very excited to run you through the supply chains webinar. And Afonso and I, as he's mentioned, we really want to make this a conversation. So to start with, we're going to try and get you to all, ask a few questions and let us know exactly what it is that you're trying to better understand from supply chain analytics and supply chain engagement with with your different stakeholders and dependent on the industry that you're in. But before we start, I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we all meet from the different places that everyone is gathering from. Afonso and myself are here in our office in Sydney CBD, so we're on the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and just want to pay my respects to past, present, and emerging elders. Kicking things off, supply chain engagement is definitely becoming a bigger and bigger focus point for companies when it comes to understanding their supply chain, their sustainability, sorry. It's very, very clear that sustainability is no longer just a nice to have, and it's becoming something that you need from a compliance perspective more than anything. So today we want to show you how to best engage with your supply chain to gather that critical information, but to do it in a way that is supportive and certainly not, certainly not, I guess, acting like the bad cop. It's actually something that's more collaborative and a journey you can walk through with them. It is important first for those of us in the room who are joining in a little bit maybe newer to sustainability to very quickly give you an overview of how carbon accounting is broken down into different scopes of emissions. I'm sure most people in the room are familiar with this, but you have your scope 1 emissions, which are your very direct emissions from your fuel sources. You then have your scope 2 emissions, which are slightly less direct, but from your energy consumption, so your electricity and gas. And then your scope 3 is everything else, and that's definitely what we're focusing on here today. That's the supply chain piece, everything from your smallest suppliers to your largest, across a very diverse range of products and services. So that's what I'm sure you've been asked to report your sustainability to one of your key clients or stakeholders at some point, and that is why you've been asked, because you fall into their scope 3 emissions.
And to begin with, I'd like everyone, if you can pop in the chat as well, maybe talk about the current industry you're working with, so we can then specify the conversations and the topics to your industry. So if you can just write something there, that'll be fantastic. And of course, if you have received a request for information, or you've actually requested your suppliers, and then if you had any struggles during the process of what to do and how to do it, also pop it in there, because we'd love to discuss those points. To begin with, what's interesting is why are we doing these webinars? Is because NetNada helps hundreds of clients, and they've started to approach us. With the question is, we've been requested some sustainability information. How do I make it readily available for them? Maybe they were already clients of NetNada. Maybe they were looking for a solution to help facilitate that conversation. And we found ourselves as a bit of advisors and a knowledge base to answer those requests around carbon emissions, but as well as things like, biodiversity, diversity, modern slavery, because you'll normally see, the broad sustainability included in those requests. Now, those requests were happening at different stages of those businesses, right? Those requests were happening even at the tender proposal phase, so acquiring new business. They were happening if you were already part of a business. Let's say you've been a client for, or like a vendor for 3+ years, and suddenly Microsoft asks you to report on your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. And of course, then the other one was applying for grants. Some grants that they were applying for now have, as part of the process, talking about sustainability. And we saw these 3 scenarios happening over and over again. Most interesting enough as well is that those requests are never the same. They are created by your clients, or in this case by yourself. So they differ in questions, they differ in time period covered, they differ in the different areas of sustainability. And our goal is to be able to cover that all, and specifically that carbon piece.
Yeah, exactly. And it's good to see in the chat that we've got people here from promotional products, from FMCG, events management, buildings and property. We'll do our very best today with all of that information, and please, keep putting information into the chat about what industry you're here from, so that we can tailor this discussion towards, your specific focuses in those industry types. So now with that in mind, and really wanting to sort of reiterate, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. We've got Francesca here who's helping out. She'll be making sure that the chat is firing and that all the questions are lined up, so that we can address any topic that you're concerned about. Once we demystify what scope 3 emissions are a little bit better, we want to start looking into the successful implementations of supply chain engagement. How are the best companies in the world doing this, and how can we take inspiration? How can we take example from what they've done? Because it doesn't matter if they're the biggest companies in the world or some very small businesses. There's key points of success that you'll see across these case studies that really remain consistent. And I think the biggest thing to start with is about making sure you're creating an environment where your suppliers can report back to you in a confident way. We're still at the stage of the journey towards net zero where transparency beats perfect 100%. And so you have to foster the right communication strategy, the right environment to let those suppliers know that you just want them to provide some data, because there you have a measurement that you can improve from. Once you get over that first step, it's about looking at how you can decarbonize your supply chain and how you can work with your suppliers. And of course, that comes with its challenges and roadblocks. But at least, from there, you're certainly on the right map, on the right road, sorry. The last thing I'd say here is, we know that you are all also, or most, I'd say most of the people in this room are all also suppliers of someone as well, right? So a big focus of this webinar is, of course, going to be how we can help you to get ready to engage with your supply chain, to get better data, to better understand your scope 3 emissions. But at the same time, we also know that you're going to be asked for the same requests. And so we'll make sure we put adequate time at the end of the session to actually focusing on how you can best answer the requests of your big clients or stakeholders.
Another point is, we know that, what are you writing in the chat is coming to us. So if you ask a question, we want to repeat it back to the group, so they understand what the context of that answer is. Another interesting thing about, you're also, vendors and clients and vice versa. Like one of the attendees, Matilde, was saying, it's about connecting the dots. Once you do something on behalf of one of the clients or you are one of the vendors, the goal here is that you expand and you share that progress, because you might incentivize others to come on their journey with you. And yes, there is a competitive advantage to be able to provide that data once you have it. But our end goal is that everyone has that data available. And then the decisions of picking different suppliers comes not just about the data, but the reduction pathways, the investments that they have made into emissions reductions, the type of product, the type of transparency, and the quality of their offering, not just that you have the emissions as a commodity to share.
For sure. And look, I think to Afonso's point there, we were speaking about this the other day, you know, what do we do at NetNada? And one of the most exciting things that you can do in this space is to support sustainable businesses. And inherently setting up good sustainable procurement policies that align with all of these global reporting strategies is exactly the way to support sustainable businesses. Because what it means is that you have the power as the sustainability manager, as the ops manager, as whoever you may be at your organization to help drive sustainable procurement, which in turn rewards the businesses in your supply chain who are doing the right thing. And it's really important to never underestimate the huge impacts that this has, because if you influence 20 of your suppliers to start, aligning with you and moving on the right path from a sustainability perspective, we're now talking hundreds and thousands of tons of CO2 emissions that you're, helping decarbonize from your supply chain by getting everything aligned, getting everything onto the same sustainability policies and reporting standards. So wherever you're operating in the world, and many of you are from multinational companies, I know, we've got different reporting standards that we need to consider. And it's very important when you're engaging with your supply chain that you consider what frameworks and methodologies they're reporting to so that you can have apples to apples comparisons. Okay, so when you're working with your suppliers, it's very important to know where they're coming from and also what that means for their reporting requirements.
A good example from the chat, we have someone here from the event management industry, and we work with a lot of clients in hospitality and event management, and of course hosting these events as like a venue. And so what's interesting is that sometimes, even if it's not a full alignment of a mandatory reporting requirement, the specifics of the request of, let's say, a conference center to their suppliers might be really particular about their company mission. They want to target a certain audience, therefore they might look into the circularity of their products because it's something that they care about, or they might look into water efficiency or transport emissions, or end use of the food that goes into the venue. Like all of these things, which are really important to understand the relationship that you have with your client if you are kind of sharing information, or the vice versa if you're sharing that with your suppliers. Now, what do you care about? Yes, you can align with the mandatory disclosures and like the overarching questions that are being suggested, but also make sure that you align those requests with something that matters and it's material for your company. If you're in logistics and you care about that, make sure that requests can then be enhanced to improve your net zero goals or your overall sustainability goals moving forward.
100%. I think with this slide in mind, of course, the thing that's top of everyone's mind is mandatory reporting disclosures in Australia, right? But it's very important, and a big reason that we asked before for everyone to put their industries in the chat is for you to be mindful of your industry-specific legislations, and to be making sure that when you engage with your suppliers, who may not be in that industry, remember, just because they're a supplier of yours doesn't mean they're in your industry, making sure that they're reporting the information that you need to align with your industry-specific legislation. So first look is about understanding the legislations that you're aligning with, understanding all of the correct, definitions and requirements from a sustainable procurement perspective, and also looking at the holistic picture around the sustainability of your supply chain. Yes, we will talk a lot about Scope 3 emissions, but it is very important that you also consider the other sustainability impacts of your suppliers, and to allow them to provide you evidence of where they are going above and beyond and past carbon emissions, as well, giving them the option to provide the additional details around their sustainable strategies and how that's relevant to your procurement.
One point as well in terms of like the request, if you look at companies like Microsoft, which has a public forum and document to talk about what they are requesting from the suppliers, you look at the time frame of, I think it's 4 years moving backwards. So suddenly these suppliers not only have to measure the emissions about the past 12 months, they have to go back 4 years, which brings a massive workload into those suppliers that want to continue to do business with Microsoft. So understanding also like that what you're doing today might impact what you put into a request in 3 years or 4 years down the line. It's really important, especially as companies get more educated and they know that they want to invest in suppliers who have a bit of a long-term strategy that's already in operation, not just moving forward. It's really important to kind of define, okay, what have I done today that can impact my answer in 3 years? So a medium-term to long-term thinking, not only in a net zero strategy, but thinking about the request you might get in the future is really important.
Yeah, 100%. And to the same point as well, I think it's very important to note down for yourself, if you are the person in your organization who's responsible for responding on the other side of the fence to the request from your key clients, there are now a lot of clear cases, especially in government, where they've gone back and looked at past tenders, and they're now asking the suppliers that they picked to prove to them the claims that they put in around their sustainability in these tenders. So it's very, very important to make sure that you're confident on your plans, as Afonso said, because moving forward, you will more and more be asked down the track to prove how your progress has been over the contract period. Now, from a large enterprise perspective, we've spoken about Microsoft, and of course, we'll also speak about AstraZeneca. We'll also speak about CBRE and JLL and the government as well, and different reporting standards that are required. It's important to understand where this is coming from. And this is coming from, first and foremost, the ISSB, so the International Sustainability Standards Board, and also Australia's mandatory disclosures and reporting frameworks. Now, Group 1 companies are organizations that have over $500 million of revenue, over 500 employees, and/or over $1 billion of assets under management. Now, these sound like very big businesses, and they certainly are, but there's a lot more of them than you would think. It then drops down to Group 2, and Group 2 companies are 250 million to 499 million of revenue. They are 250 employees to 499 employees, and they are $500 million of assets to $1 billion of assets. It then drops down to Group 3, and Group 3 is 100 million, 100 plus employees, and/or $250 million assets. So if any company has 2 out of 3 of those criteria points, they fall into that grouping. Now, Group 1, as I'm sure many of you are aware, are now required to be reporting from January 1st, 2025. The initial consultation paper was pushed back. It was supposed to be new financial year 25, which would have been obviously July 1st, but it has now been pushed back to January 1st, 2025, so calendar year, where they will now be required for their mandatory reporting on Scope 1 and 2 emissions. Here's where it comes into effect, where you as a supplier are being affected by this, and your suppliers are being affected, and so on and so forth in the ripple effect. The following year of the first year of reporting for each of these groups, they are then required to start planning for the following year to have their Scope 3 reported on. So what's happening at the moment is, although Group 1 aren't required to report on their Scope 3 until 2027, they are now getting organized, getting prepared, doing practice runs, you may say, to get their house in order and to start better understanding their supply chain. And so that's why a lot of people in this webinar would have already felt the pinch a little bit. And I'm sure you've been reached out to by some of your bigger clients and by some of your big clients, but also smaller companies who are maybe just on the edges of those groups are also preparing as if they are going to grow. And so they're also now starting to do this supply chain engagement because they know it's going to be a mandatory requirement for them, but they also know that it's something that their key stakeholders and clients are asking for as well.
Which brings to a question that was asked in the chat, which reads, as a small company who is not being affected by mandatory reporting requirements in the next 5 years, so you might have SMB with 30 employees, why should I conduct that supply chain engagement piece? So from conducting the engagement, what allows you to is first, position yourself as a leader in that space by reaching out to your broader, supply chain and communicate those efforts. So first is that like positioning piece, but secondly, the moment you approach, your larger clients, because you might sell to a larger client, that you are doing this effort and actually thinking ahead, it's suddenly to the procurement manager, to the sustainability manager, they understand the education level and the complexities of the things that you're dealing with, which allows you to kind of push things over the edge in terms of them trusting that you're providing, good and accurate information. So that those kind of like two pieces. As part of most of our clients that join Etnara, regardless of size, they conduct their own supply chain engagement, which means that they email or they contact, we contact on their behalf, requesting suppliers to do what we call a transparency assessment, regardless of size. And we see a massive outcome of that in understanding different pain points, or sometimes actually bringing, your suppliers on board to drive initiatives in investment in certain areas of positioning, of researching, or just unlocking new opportunities. And this happens regardless of size.
Yeah, I agree. And I think adding to that question, why you should consider it would be the same reason why the big companies are considering it. And the reason for that is because they want granularity and understanding of the difference between supplier A, supplier B, supplier C in, say, category catering services, so that they can start to differentiate between who are sustainable suppliers, who align with their values and ethics from a sustainability perspective, and who are going to help them to decarbonize the lion's share of their emissions, which is scope 3. That's exactly the same reason why you, as a small business owner who may have 30 employees, as Afonso pointed out, would do the same thing, because the chances are that your scope 3 emissions represent 70 to 80% of your overall emissions, maybe more, right? And so the better information you can get from your supply chain means the more accurate analysis you can do, which means your scope 3 emissions don't just become much more accurate, they now become much more actionable as well. You can start to pull levers on your supply chain and your scope 3 emissions, which is a very exciting thing, especially when it comes to businesses who are hoping to be carbon neutral or businesses who are hoping to get different certifications, and now puts the power of your supply chain in your hands.
We had another message here, which is requesting a table of those timelines. We'll send that to you after the webinar in terms of like the different groups and categories that summarize that. That was created by Francesca in our team. The other point that was also raised here was, someone mentioned that they had a client that told us they wouldn't able to tender for contract renewal unless they have engaged and managed their supply chain. So we see that often sometimes the terms or the conditions change and the terminology describing this also changes. It might be engaged, might be managed, or just do what we call, a supply chain like risk analysis, which might not be having every of your suppliers sharing emissions, but at least pinpointing who has, who hasn't, and who's undergoing that progress. So you'd see like, a risk ratio on your suppliers that goes from, 1 to 10, and understanding if most of your expenditure or emissions are coming from a supplier that has not shared emission data or is not planning on doing so, then you flag that as a risk, and you could either start, educating the supplier or looking for alternatives in that sense.
Yeah, 100%. And look, we are certainly realists in the sense that we know that when you do a supply chain engagement, you're never going to receive 100% responses. But the best practice and the goals to shoot for is the highest engagement rate you can possibly get. Hopefully that some of the lessons in this webinar will help you to engage that, to achieve that, sorry. Which will mean then when you are asked in that scenario in a tender for a contract, you'll be able to give more specific information on how many of your suppliers you have clear information for. And you might find out that a bunch of your suppliers are already doing fantastic things in sustainability and you just didn't know about it. And so that's a huge win in itself, just to capture some of that information so you know for the future. Okay, awesome. So as we touched on before, it is really important when you're engaging with your supply chain to consider their entire sustainability holistically. So you do want to be looking at all of their environmental impacts. You also want to be looking at all their social impacts as well. You want to take that, holistic approach to their ESG. So the best way to go about it is if they have sustainability reports, right? Fantastic. Let them share them with you. That's hopefully got all the information you need. If they've got data books, fantastic. Let them share them with you. If they don't really have everything together, you can direct them to answer, key questions that give you very good indicators on their overall sustainability performance. But it'll give you a good spread of understanding, okay, which of my suppliers are, really excelling and focusing from an environmental perspective, which of my suppliers may not be performing too highly there, but are, got some really good social policies in place and are doing, their best to really make sure they manage the impact on the people connected to their business. And which of my suppliers, have really good policies around their governance, and hopefully, a few of your suppliers have everything.
Yeah, and it brings to, I'm just reading a question here, what is your engagement rate across SMEs? That was asking there. We don't have like ready available like the breakdown between different parts of sustainability. We have an overall like engagement rate when our clients conduct that supply chain. Our first initial target is to go after the first 50% or to 30% emissions contribution. So we start with the larger ones, and we go and we conduct that engagement. We might bring our clients to a webinar where they invite their own suppliers, and then we educate them all together. When it comes to the answers, we see, like Lochie said, some never looked at emissions before, but they have policies on diversity, modern slavery, and even like security, and they rarely share that with you. But you can see definitely a data gap in terms of like emissions or other parts of sustainability. What's interesting enough is to look at like how outdated some of those policies might be. Your client might think they have their house in order and then share with you like a policy from 2010 that hasn't been updated and just states, we are, environmentally conscious and we care about the planet. But for the past 15 years, they haven't, changed that or implemented on that. So that makes you a really good wake-up call to understand, where those data gaps might be. The average engagement, once they kind of reply positively in answering those requests, is almost like 100%. Once we see engagement from a supplier who wants to provide data, we're able to lead them all the way to supply all the necessary data to at least get an initial assessment and pinpoint them in the risk matrix.
Yeah, I think just adding to that and putting all of that into context to that question that was asked. So, from an SME's perspective, when engaging with their supply chain, you might see 30 to 50% of suppliers that respond with some form of answer, right? Everything from, no, I don't have anything at all, to yes, here we go. And Afonso's point on the ones who, have a lot of information, 100% engagement with them, it's fantastic. Some of the others are a bit slower. You're always going to get scenarios where people just put it in the too hard basket, don't read the email, whatever it may be. So that's why we sit somewhere from a 30 to 50% engagement for SMEs. The engagement rates are higher for larger organizations. And I think it is very important to flag that. That's just a reality of business, that if you're a big company and you're, some of your suppliers' biggest client, fair to expect that they're going to be more readily compliant with your requests. If you're a very small company, you will get a slightly lower engagement rate. Putting this all into context to something that we can all associate with, Qantas's carbon offsetting engagement rates, right, are 9% for domestic flights and 4% for international flights, right? And about a 6% average across. So you're getting much better engagement, even if you're an SME, than the average punter who chooses whether they offset or not. Okay, so I think it shows the decision-making process that's happening with business leaders. This is something that they act more readily on than your typical consumer does.
Yeah. Also to note that sometimes there's nuances to this data, which is you might be dealing with like, an SME as a supplier, but might be your biggest contract. Let's say you have a 10 million turnover And yes, you might sell some services to, a university or, Optus and so forth. Maybe a small contract, but maybe most of your revenue is coming from, 6 contracts that are actually other SMEs and not really like group 1 or group 2 companies. And you'd see, potentially engagement in that and vice versa. In terms of another question here of offshore production and auditing that data. Audits will come if you're looking at, mostly offshore about like modern slavery, working conditions and so forth. When it comes to emissions data, by looking at the source documents is really kind of straightforward to audit, and you might not need to be on site to check on the quality of the data.
Yeah, but unfortunately, to your question, we don't have an offshore audit partner that we would recommend. I think, to be honest, the best way to go about, I'm happy to chat about this with the person who asked the question after the session. It would have to be very case by case, because obviously it's a big wide world. So we certainly at the moment don't know of any one specific auditor who's great for everywhere. But yeah, looking at where your product lines come from and country that is in question, yeah, we could talk about who ideal audit providers are in that location. Okay, awesome. So we're already into these key dates. Things are moving very fast. The Department of Finance has published the reporting standards, and the reporting, as I mentioned before, is only, 3 months away now. So businesses are now directly trying to engage to get better understanding of their scope 3 from a preparations perspective, and also from a broader sustainability perspective as well. What's being asked, and what should you expect to ask or be asked of? Your sustainability planning and procedures. Now, we've spoken a lot about data, and data is the most important thing here, but what you will be asked for and what you will be expected to ask of your suppliers is actually more information around their procedures, how they're set up, how they're governing these practices to make sure that this is a consistent, reliable process that they're following that's governed correctly. Okay, so number 1. Number 2 is you're not only going to be asked for things like carbon emissions or CO2e, you're not only going to be asked for those more sort of standard broad metrics, you will often also be asked for the units of measurement and the activity data behind these metrics. So for example, you should be ready to both ask and provide information on kilowatt hour usage and consumption, your mix of renewables versus non-renewables, your water consumption, your waste and recycling data in tons and kilograms and volumes if possible, and also where your material efficiencies are if you're a product-based company. Lastly, as we spoke about before, from a social and governance perspective, you also will be asked and should be asking for information of social considerations, modern slavery, diversity, equity, inclusion, labour rights, and also different compliance, governance, and certifications that companies may hold. Now, certifications are a great tick box in this scenario. It really does put you as sort of a starred and recognized supplier. A lot of certifications that we're seeing being asked for commonly are carbon neutral ratings in different jurisdictions. B Corp certainly is coming up a lot. Businesses want to know that their suppliers align with frameworks and methodologies that they respect. And so when you are putting together your own sustainability supply chain engagement, it's important to have a discussion internally if there are any certifications you already hold that they are things you want to collect information on if your suppliers also hold them, or if there are certifications that you're striving for and you think that, to Afonso's point before, in your roadmap, in your sustainability plans, that is something you may have in the next 1, 2, 4 years, also putting that in to collect that information so you know if your suppliers are aligning with that.
Another point is, if you are, and we had people here in fast consumer goods, if you are, selling a physical product and maybe you're just, a medium-sized business and you have only 5 different lines of products, looking at product-specific emissions, LCAs, EPDs, recyclability of materials. Same thing in the food industry, looking at the government of your own supply chain to the product that you are supplying is really important, because at the end of the day, you're a big organization, But if you're selling a product, not a service, looking at what that entails might really set you apart, because your client might only buy one product from you at scale, and they want to understand what's behind that.
100%. And that's where it comes back to, the importance of being able to report on units of measurement that is, specifically relevant. So as we spoke about, there are some incredible case studies that, you can't go past. And I think it would be, it's very important to take the huge learnings out of them. And AstraZeneca is a fantastic example of how to do supply chain engagement, of how to do supplier sustainability reporting, but also how to support those suppliers in order to achieve this. AstraZeneca managed to get 95% of their supply chain, which is over 3,500 organizations, to report in alignment with the SBTI, so with the Science-Based Targets Initiative. Now, for anyone here who's not familiar with the SBTIs, it is a very, very diligent and respected reporting framework that also provides forecasts into where companies plan on going. And this is not something that's done lightly. So what they did is they engaged with their suppliers over an extended period of time. They made it very clear why they were doing this, which is so important from the communications perspective. They made it very clear how they planned on achieving it and how they gave many check-in points to all of their suppliers to support them along the way. They also gave their suppliers access to supporting organizations and advisors who could help them achieve this. The SBTIs are not something that anyone can just go and figure out. And so AstraZeneca made sure that they were supporting each of their suppliers with the right providers of support. And then what they did, which came with a little bit more of a carrot and probably a stick approach to finish, was they made it very clear that they had a date where they expected all of their suppliers in key areas to be reporting to them in alignment. So what they did was they picked a few of their high emissions areas where critical pieces of their supply chain were responsible for large percentages of their overall emissions, and they targeted them in a phased approach. And they worked through that phased approach with each of these key groups to make sure that it was achievable for all of these stakeholders. They then moved on to the next group, so on and so forth. And over a few years period, they managed to achieve 95% reporting. So that's the sort of playbook and the steps from the very get-go of engaging your suppliers as to why you're doing this, making it a journey that they can come along with you on, making it not something where you're just, pushing it down their throat. In fact, making it something that you're supporting them with and providing them with the connection to that support, and then giving very, very clear guidelines and steps as to, when it needs to be achieved by and what it looks like to achieve it.
Awesome. And it comes to a point, there was a question asked just now about if I find a carbon neutral supplier in my supply chain, can I make that carbon neutrality relevant in my own emissions, right? You do this engagement and you find out that a product might be carbon neutral, that your client or your supplier has actually neutralized those emissions. You can then incorporate those savings into your carbon inventory. Of course, there's a risk to that, and you can hold that risk, which is, okay, which methodology have they used to calculate emissions? Is it an LCA? Is it estimated? Is it, overall?
Can you explain what an LCA is?
A life cycle assessment. So this is the process you go through to really understand, the emissions associated with one product line, from creation of that product, the source materials, all the way to the processing, to the recyclability and use of the product. So you take that information, it's been neutralized, you can then, zero that out in your emissions inventory. What we do recommend companies to do is to have what's called a double reporting, where you showcase the emissions if you don't take carbon neutrality into account, and when you do take carbon neutrality into account. Another really interesting point is, when a company overall claims carbon neutrality, to understand if the emissions measured were actually complete, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and even inside scope 3, that 1 to 15 categories. And then you can incorporate that measurements, and platforms like NetNara will help you and assist you on flagging those emissions, or neutralizing them, and making sure that your inventory spits out correctly. the one point that Lochie said in terms of bringing your supplier on a journey, right? Sometimes it's really easy. You might not have the big budget in the education team that AstraZeneca has, but just holding a webinar, putting the comms out, joining forces with Etnara to, collaborate in messaging might really just be, that kind of kickoff moment you need to kind of roll this initiative forward in the next 2 years, 3 years, or decade down the line.
I think as well, keeping the spotlight on AstraZeneca and using them as the example. In their supply chain, they have a very diverse group of suppliers from everything from services through to multiple different products. And what they did really well was understand their suppliers, understand what it was that their suppliers provided them, and where it was necessary, to Afonso's point, of just understanding the overall sustainability of that business. Say, for example, a service-based business like consultants, and then also understanding where they needed to understand specifics about the life cycle assessment analysis or the different product lines that a particular provider gave them, maybe their packaging, for example, right? And so in this supplier engagement piece, it's really important to give your suppliers the opportunity to provide you as much data as possible about the different products and services that they provide you, and use your own subject matter expertise about your industry, about your company, about your supply chain to understand where maybe from certain suppliers you should be asking for a little bit more information.
Just with consciously with 2 minutes to go, would love for you to post any last questions in that Q&A for us to do so. Because we want to make sure this is relevant, and also if you want to drop us a note afterwards as well, Lochie and I or the team could go back and answer them. You'll have our emails to contact afterwards. If not, we kind of just want to leave on that message of this is going from a nice to have to a license to operate, in terms of before the first mover advantage was there, that if you did this 3-5 years ago, you were kind of like really breaking through. And now it's just becoming something that you need to have as a business, either in that supplying information or engaging your own supply chain. And it will make sure that our clients or our community is leading the effort on having information readily available, thinking about their own house in order, but also assisting others in requesting information from others.
Yeah, for sure. So any questions, any additional questions, we'd love to hear them. And I think there's a question in the Q&A box, apparently. But yeah, we really hope that session was helpful. Hopefully it gave you a bit of a better understanding of maybe why you're being asked for supplier information, but also how you can do it in the most productive way possible with your supply chain as well.
Just a last question from Fiona, understand of scope through, we want to move away from assumption-based calculations. What would that be? So assumption-based is normally the question about estimating based on financial purchases or that currency transaction versus looking at what was actually bought or acquired during that transaction. So I could estimate the emissions of buying this table by the price and what it is versus understanding that is a wooden table and has a certain weight and is coming from a certain region. And carbon accounting tools can assist you on differentiating between both and requesting from your supplier any information about this table that you might need to calculate that.
Yeah. And there's sort of two questions that are touching on the same point. So one question, is there any pushback from suppliers who are concerned about sharing proprietary information? And another question, how should we handle suppliers that are resistant to changing their ways? So firstly, of course, you're always going to receive pushback, right? I'd be living in a fantasy land if I said you won't. But the good thing about that is what it does is it shows you which of your suppliers are aligned to the same, same policies and future thinking that you are. When you do receive pushback, it's not the end of the world, right? These analytics tools, methodologies, frameworks are set up so that you can still make assumptions and analysis based off financial spend with a supplier, their industry and sub-industry, but it of course will only be giving them the estimate assumption factor. So it's not ideal, and it really is important to encourage them to provide you more information. Sometimes though, to their fairness, to the supplier, they may have, as you pointed out in your question, proprietary information around maybe a specific material they use or a specific, supplier that they have that they don't want, anyone to know about, not from a bad perspective, but just because it's critical to their supply chain. That certainly does happen with us. And so what we always do is try and look at ways that we can collect the same level of quality data without the confidential information, right? So a good example is we have a client who manufactures goods. They didn't want us to speak directly with their suppliers of the materials, but they did tell us exactly the volumes, weights, where the materials have come from, and the exact type of materials that we use. So we could make a much more accurate analysis of that rather than just a dollar spend for maybe a type of plastic that wasn't specific, very specific. So that's I hope that answers your question, Ed.
Well, we're 2 minutes over the time. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We'll be releasing the recording, doing more on these sessions. And again, this is a collaborative way. We want to be a community. Any ideas, any partners, any suggestions, send it our way, and we'll amplify that message and make this happen. Thank you so much, and have a fantastic Wednesday, and see you all very soon.